Everybody, it's Claire here from Sewing by Claire, and today we are going to be making part 3 of our sew along for the chalk and notch Marcel dress, and this is a beginner friendly sew along that I am doing, and hopefully I'm picking lots of tips and tricks in there for you, so that if you're new to sewing for yourself, then you can just start to, through the process, absorb some of the information and the knowledge that you will accumulate over multiple makes. So as I said in the first and second videos, don't try and learn all of this off by heart and apply it every single time or make it into a chore for yourself, because every single one of my videos includes a lot of these tips, or I use these processes. So over time, if you continue to follow my channel, then it will build into a knowledge bank of dressmaking experience for you, and hopefully that will show in the makes that you then enjoy wearing over time. So I chose the chalk and notch Marcel dress because it comes in sizes 0 to 30, which I think is a lovely, nice, hopefully you agree, size inclusive range. Plus there's so much room in the skirt of this dress as well that, you know, apart from some changes that you might want to make to the band, then, you know, hopefully there's a size in there for everybody. And it's just a lovely comfy dress to wear as well. I've got the 2 dresses so far. My mum liked it so much that I'm now making one for her. So waffle over. In the first part we went on what we covered the measurements, talking about the pattern itself and the design features of it, talking about why line drawings are important, talking about why taking accurate measurements and not focusing on the number of them, because everything you make from this point forward can be individually you-sized. You know, it's not a one size fits all, and you don't have to try and squeeze into everything. Over time we can learn the skills to alter the pattern, so we've got the base for the design, but then we add in the unique features, whether it's height or width or depth in certain areas, and we can tweak those patterns over time to make them absolutely individual to you and your unique perfect self. So you know, that was the message I wanted to get across to you in part 1. And then in part 2 we made a toile for the band here, and we talked about where to, if you needed to add any extra into this band pattern itself, where you would do that, and if you added it in or took it out, how you would go about doing that. We also talked about adjusting patterns for height as well, because a pattern will be drafted, depending on the designer, for a standard height as well. And so if you find that you are generally taller than, I'm going to say, the norm, or what has been drafted for the pattern, you'll need to know how to add length in and where to add it. But also conversely, if you find that you're slightly more petite in terms of your sizing for either ready to wear or for the pattern designer as well that you're choosing to make the pattern from, then again you'll need to just tweak that pattern down. And why we don't just take it out of one place, the hem, why we try and keep the proportions of the dress intact as we're doing that. So the next stage then, part 3, is we're going to start and cut our fabric out. So we're actually going to get our hands on our fabric, and this is the one that I'm going to be using for my mum. It's a lovely floaty lightweight viscose, and that's a natural fibre, so that's going to be really great in the heat for when my mum comes to visit me over here in southern Spain where I live. And actually that's exactly the same fabric as this dress here, so it's obviously not the same design, but it's the same composition of the fabric. This is 100% viscose and this is 100% viscose. This one's slightly floatier, so you do just have to have a little look at it when you're buying it, but I can see that that's got lots of lovely drape and movement, and for these tiers and the gathers that is going to look really, really nice. So your fabric needs, if you're jumping ahead to this one because you think there's not so much in the other videos that you might want to watch, hopefully I've given you a flavour and you do think it's worth grabbing a cup of coffee and watching those videos. But then we now need to take that adjusted pattern that we've got, and we're now going to lay our fabric out. We're going to talk about working with so much fabric, because I've actually got 3 meters here that I'm working with, you know, so fabric fabric management, etc. is key on this type of situation, because it can feel a bit overwhelming, especially if you've been making smaller things, either dolls or doll making patterns, or you've been making children's clothes or home decor, excluding curtains. If you make curtains, then you'll be used to dealing with a lot of fabric. But in some cases, people aren't used to dealing with that, and so I want to talk to you about that. I want to talk to you about cutting out and how to lay out your pattern onto the fabric, and then we'll get to the end of it. Now, will we do our notches now? Possibly, yeah. Let's include notches as well on this video, so that the next time we actually come to sewing part 4, we're actually ready to sew and ready to start constructing our pattern and our garment really. So yes, I'll turn the camera around. I'm going to raise my table, because if you've watched my reveal video on my new sewing space, it's not a new room, but the fit out has been new. Then that video just went live a couple of days, well actually yesterday I think, and so, or this morning, one of the two. So I've got a rising desk now, which I'm absolutely thrilled with, and it's got an overhang that will now fold out and make a cutting table for me. So if you want to have a look at that video, please pop along to have a look at that one. But if not, let's get on with making our dress. Okay, so I have my 3 meters of fabric here that I'm using for the one for my mum. And we spoke before about pre-washing your fabric, and I might have forgotten to have told you that I do overlock, or you can zigzag, or use your pinking shears, the ones that cut the little triangle cuts into the edge of your fabric, before you wash it, just so that you don't get a whole unravelling of fibres all the way along the length of it, and that does just save that. And also it's a good reminder that this piece has already been washed, because I will overlock the edge and then it'll go straight into the washer or in the washing basket, ready for washing and then pressing before I use it. The other thing to point out as well is that you need to sort of like get used to looking for your selvage edge. So this can look like an ordinary frayed edge at first, but look how the printing doesn't go right up to the edge over here. Some colours have done, but some colours haven't. And usually there's a bound edge on the edge of your fabric, and that's what it looks like from the back, and that is called your selvage edge, and that's the extent, the width of the fabric across. So the length will be as long as the whole bolt is, just depends on the manufacturer as to how long that is, but the actual width will generally be in set sizes, and you'll know that you've got the selvage edges because that's the long piece, that the long edge that runs along the design of your fabric. If you've only bought a metre at a time, it can sometimes be difficult to tell which orientation your fabric needs to be in, but we'll always, unless we're working with a border print, but that's for a different day, but generally speaking, you will be laying your pattern pieces along, north to south, along the edge of the length of your fabric, in line with your selvage edges. So it's important to know what a selvage edge is and where it is, which is the first important thing. And then when we're working with fabric, we can see just how long this fabric is and how it can start to slip and slide around. And if you get it too close to the edge, what happens? The weight of the fabric over the edge is pulling the fabric off the edge of the desk. And as you start to cut your fabric out, if you've got all of this weight over the edge, as you cut, you'll see the tension start to form on your fabric, and you can distort the fabric underneath your paper pattern piece. So it's really important to know about that. Excuse my hair being pinned up, it's just so that it's out of the way, because with my head down and up all the time it gets in the way. So, so it's really important to start and think about using pattern weights or the way that we fold the fabric, in order that we don't have this drag where it just wants to fall off the table, especially with the slippier fabrics, or that when we start to cut through it, you get a big gap start to form between your pieces, and that can distort underneath. So if you were cutting across a waist seam and there was pulling on the fabric below the pattern piece that was for your bodice, you might find that when you actually have cut that pattern piece off, depending on how well you've pinned it, in between the pins you could have a jagged edge where the pressure of the fabric has pulled that fabric down from underneath the pattern, but then when you snip it, it kind of jumps up a little bit. So that's why it's important to make sure that we've we've got our fabric properly weighted. The other thing that you need to be aware of as well, in terms of fabric, is that you need to be aware of what direction your pattern design is going. Because even though this is a floral, I'll just spread this out over the table, even though this is a beautiful floral, it might be that we can notice that there's what's called a directional print, that these flowers work better in a different orientation to the one that I think originally. Let me just move those pins out of the way so we can have a little look. So again, you're just trying to look at the way that this is. So I can see that one flower is sort of like north to south, but these flowers are looking like they're upside down, and those ones look like they're upside down. And these turquoise ones that are repeating, to me, look like they're upside down. So in that respect, just have a quick look at your fabric, well, more than a quick look, have a look at your fabric and just see if you have a preference over which way it goes. Obviously, if it's a polka dot, then it's not going to matter because that's just multi-changeable. But when you look at this garment, you don't want to look at it after you've cut it out and think, do you know what, I should have had it the other way round. The other thing that is really useful to do as well is to take a picture of your fabric in black and white. So again, that's a really useful way of looking at your fabric and just deciding whether or not there's a pattern inherent in it that you're not sure about, or that you need to take into account. Maybe there's a gentle stripe within that fabric that you've not noticed. It's just by the pattern repeat bunching through, and that's all important when you come to look at cutting things out. So I'll take a picture of this in black and white, and then I'll pop them up for you so you can have a look as well, and we can also have a look at the fabric and just decide whether or not we need to go upside down or not. And it might be that both are pretty much the same, and that's fine, but we need to check that that is the case before we start laying our pattern pieces out. So let me take some photographs so I can load them up for you, and then we'll come back when we're talking about how to fold our fabric for cutting it out. Okay, so now we've looked at those photographs, I've chosen the orientation that I'm going to use my fabric, and it's going to be in this orientation. So I'm going to be, that's my north, this is my south where I'm standing. And then we need to talk about how we fold fabric when we're dressmaking, because there are some trains of thoughts. In couture sewing, you will always cut your fabric out on the single. So you will position your fabrics onto the your pattern pieces onto your fabric, in order that you can see the pattern placement underneath your pattern pieces. And so they will cut things out on the single. So that's just one single layer of fabric, a right side and a wrong side, and that's it. Now, the advantage of that is that sometimes you can get more out of your fabric, so your fabric goes further. So, and you'll see that on in your pattern instructions, it'll give you a layout guide as to how to lay it out for each pattern that you ever choose. It does give a little bit of a complication for beginner sewers, because you need to remember to mirror your pieces. So a sleeve piece, for example, if we were making a jacket or a dress, isn't symmetrical. There's a difference in the armhole shaping here on the top of the sleeve head and going down and into the underarm, which you need to do. So you'd have one piece with, say, you're writing on your pattern up, and then you'd have to flick that piece over to do your second piece in order to draw around it and trace around it. And that type of sewing generally doesn't include seam allowances, so you need to be aware of if the pattern you're using has got seam allowances included or not. The Marcel dress has 1 centimetre seam allowances included, because you need to allow extra around your pattern pieces to give you a seam allowance. So if we spoke before, if I just show you on this dress, we spoke before, seam allowance, we get my seam here, is the bit that stays on the inside of your fabric. Sorry, the lighting's a bit dark, but I need to compensate for the window. So here I can see my stitch line for my sewing. Anything towards this side here is seam allowance. That depth there is seam allowance, and this is my actual garment, because when we pull that open, there's the smooth line of where the seam is, but on the inside you've got your seam allowance that sticks up. So again, you need to account for that, so you've got enough room to be able to attach your two pieces of fabric together if you're doing a couture type sewing thing. So just be aware that it exists at this stage. The other way that a lot of fabric companies will fold their fabric, or pattern designers when they're cutting out, is they will fold their fabric so that you put the two selvage edges together, and then you have that running all the way down for your fabric piece. So you sit one on top of the other, make sure you've got your raw edges, well, your selvage edges together, and then you then adjust your fabric. And that's the way that will work for quite a lot of designs, especially if you've got like the Upton dress. I would definitely put the fabric out this way to cut it out, because when you cut it out this way, you get your right and your left at the same time without having to remember to mirror your pieces. And that's all fine if you've got a front bodice that's going to be cut on the fold, because this is my folded edge and this is my selvage edges. And then you can slot your back next to it, and you're going to use the full width of your fabric. There is an issue though when you have a design where you have a lot of pieces cut on the fold, and this is true of the Marcel dress. And the way that I've worked out best to cut this out in order to make the most of my fabric is that rather than have one folded edge here and the two selvage edges together, if you watch, I'm actually going to fold in my selvage edges into the middle, so that on the same width of fabric, when I've got this all sorted out and it doesn't start falling off the table for me, actually gives me two folded edges. So I've got one fold here, here's my two selvage edges in the middle, and I've got another folded edge along here. So likewise, the centre front panel here and the centre back panel, the front of the bodice and the back of the bodice, those are all cut on the fold, and therefore by folding my fabric this way, I found I get a lot more out of my dress. So this is the way that I'm going to recommend we fold our fabric. And so roughly fold it together into this way, because then I want to talk to you about grain lines and why that's so important. And I'll just straighten up the other end of the fabric without sort of walking past the camera all the time, and then we can work on how we actually make sure that we've still got our fabric straight when we've got this edge along here, the centre, you know, the selvage edges along the centre here. So let me get onto that bit, and I'll tell you in a second. So on our pattern pieces, the grain line, which is what we want to talk about at the moment, is this long straight line here that goes down pattern pieces generally that aren't cut on the fold, because if you cut on the fold, then you'll generally follow the folded edge of your fabric. But on pieces that aren't on the fold, you then have this line here, which is a straight line, and then it's got a little point at the top and a little point at the bottom. And what that means is that this pattern piece has to go north to south on your fabric. If this same pattern piece had an arrow across this way, then I would turn the pattern piece so that arrow was going north to south along the selvage edge. So if you think about that line there denoting that it's got to follow the line of the selvage edge, which is your bound edge in your fabric here, then you won't go far wrong. Likewise, sometimes you get a grain line that's on the diagonal, and that means that that piece has to be cut at 45 degrees, and therefore if you again have that line in line with your folded edge or with your selvage edge, you will automatically then lay it out and cut it out on the bias. And remember that we said before that you sometimes get a little bit of stretch on a bias, so some designs need that little bit of stretch. Or if you're working with a stripe and you want a decorative feature, or if you're working with something like a plaid or something like that, sometimes you'll have, you know, the yoke of a shirt on the diagonal and the rest of it is on straight of grain. So think of these lines here, the grain line, and it is a really important line, so I hope you've traced that onto your pattern pieces, and if not, go back and do that because it is important. Runs in line with the selvage edge, which is your bound edge on your fabric. So we've got all of our pattern pieces here, so let's go through it all. We've got, this is the side panel tier 1, where's tier 2, and you can count along with me as well, that's 4, That's the centre back. So let's just split these out. So there's our tiers. That's tier 3. That's for our bodice. This is tier 5. So that's going to be along here. So again, you had to do some long bits of tracing, but we'll talk about that again in a minute. This is tier 2. So 1, 2, 3. That's tier 4. That's tier 5. So make sure you've got all of your 5 tiers together. So put all those in one pile. I've then got, this is my centre front, and this is my centre back. And then we've got our bodice pieces, which are our centre back. We've got our strap, and we've also got our front bodice piece as well. So we've got all of those. So just roughly put those together. Now you'll notice that we've got these really long pieces of fabric here, which is your pattern piece, which is your centre front and your centre back. And they've also got a grain line on them, so we know that they're going to run north to south. Now, depending on the size that you've fallen into in terms of tracing off, this width here could quite easily use up one side of our fabric there. And then we've got another one here, because this is cut on the fold, the front pieces, or the back pieces, and then the front piece as well. Both the front and the back are cut on the fold. Let me just move my tiers out of the way for a second. So before I start measuring this up, I'm just having a look at the pattern pieces and seeing what sort of pieces we've got to start and put together. So these are very narrow pieces of fabric. I have got a fold line on there, which I will put up to my fold line. So I can actually narrow these folded pieces of fabric away from the centre in order to give me a long length down the middle that we can perhaps use for something else. It's all going to make sense, just bear with me. Just watch this section first through before you start doing yours, because sometimes it may feel like I contradict myself, because I've told you to put all the folded edges into the middle, and now I'm talking to you about folding them out again. But it'll all make sense if you bear with me. Okay, so what we're going to do with these pieces now is we've roughly got a dimension. I'm going to pull the selvage edge back towards the folded edge, so I make this single fabric in the middle wider until we're using pretty much all of our fabric. We don't ever include the selvage edge in what we're doing. And we can move this fabric down as well. I'm just going to move in front of the camera, excuse me. Because the other thing is I've got a lot of overhang over the edge here. So I'm going to move my fabric down, so I've got the top edge at the top here. But in order that we don't lose the fabric over the other end, I'm going to use a pattern weight. So I've got this one here that my friend Pam made for me, which is really sweet of her. And it's got sand inside it. It's got a really dense inner lining so that the sand doesn't come out. But that's a good one to use. And that's a really nice one, just to plonk on the bottom there. And that'll just make sure that the fabric doesn't run off the table for me. If you haven't got any pattern weights, you can either use plastic bottles full of water and just stand those on the end. That's got a nice weight to it. Tins, soup tins, chickpea tins, tinned beans, you know, those types of things work really well for holding and anchoring your fabric down. So let's have a look just here at the moment. We'll need to do some adjustment. So I'm going to take this fabric up towards the top, so that's starting to come together. But what I'm trying to do is just narrow the fold on this fabric so that my pattern piece, from the folded edge of the pattern piece to about half an inch or an inch off the edge of the fabric here, off to selvage edge, is narrow enough to fit this piece on. I'm going to do the same with the other side as well. And you might think, well, you're going to have a long strip down here, but I've got a plan for that. And this has worked quite well for me when I've been doing the other bits. So we're going to just roughly move this side of the fabric out in order that we're roughly in line with where we want this folded line to be. And just smooth your fabric down. I might just have to move my table slightly so I can get around it. So that's about right. So I've got about half an inch to an inch either side, just so we've got a nice borderline to work with. So now I'm going to take my fabric piece off, my pattern piece off, and using my tape measure, I'm going to just measure from the selvage edge to the folded edge at that point. And 10.5 inches for the size that I'm making is right. Yours will be a different measurement. So just have a look at that. You might be narrower if you've managed to trace off a smaller size, or you may be slightly wider if you've traced off a bigger size. So just have a look at that. So I want this fabric to be ending on 10.5 inches. And there we go. And I'm just going to put a pattern weight on the end there just to hold that still. The other thing is that sometimes your cut edge of your fabric may not be straight either. So just bear in mind with that. Keep an eye on the weave of your fabric and just make sure that it's just lying as flat as possible. I'm then going to come down a little bit further and measure again, and that's 11.25. So I know that this fabric has come out slightly. So I just manipulate the fabric until again we've got a 10.5. So that's still 11, so that's still too wide. Until we've got 10.5 to that point there, a little bit too much. 10.5, and then I'm just going to put a pattern weight on again as I just move out the way of my chair. Oh, I've got a cable I need to accommodate to, although I can unplug that, can't I? Yeah, I can unplug that for the moment. Oh, I need to breathe in. Okay, and then we're going to move down the back, down this fabric until all the way down the length we're at 10.5 inches. And you can sometimes just scrape your fingernails across the fabric and that will manoeuvre it enough for you just to make sure that you're in the right place. 10.5, another pattern weight. This one was from my friend Tara. And then as we go down, just make sure you've got no creases underneath your fabric. So that's too wide as well. And let's do that piece on there. I've gone too small. And the reason why this is important, I go on about grain line a lot, so if you've not watched any, of my other videos, then grain line is really important, because if ever you've had like a t-shirt and you've laundered it, washed it, and then the t-shirt won't lie flat on your ironing board, that's because the fabric's been slightly off grain when it's been cut out. And so making sure that everything's straight of grain when we come to put our pattern pieces on means that in the future that pattern, that dress and that garment will hang correctly, and you won't get some weird shapes and different bits going off. So I've got my pattern weights on here. This is holding my pattern piece in place, or my fabric in place for me. I can then take my pattern piece, and then so long as I'm not right up to the very top, I can now move my pattern so that the fold edge of the pattern is sitting on top of the folded line of the fabric. And I can see that through my tracing paper, and I'm just repositioning my pattern weights as I go. So you might be repositioning your cans or tins or whatever you're using. And you need the line of the fold line on the edge of your pattern to be exactly on that folded edge. So just put your fingers on it and you should be able to see through your tracing paper, and make sure that at every point that line is sticking on top. Otherwise, when you cut it out, your line will go in and out again. Once you're happy that you've got it in place with your pattern weights, then we're going to take our pins and we're going to pin it on place. Now, I don't measure my grain line again at this point, because we've already measured that the fabric is equal from the selvage edge to the folded edge, and that is sufficient to make sure this pattern piece is going to be straight. So let me just, I don't pin down the folded edge, I just pin down the loose edge, and I pin probably every couple of inches just to hold that in place. And if you're using a fine fabric, then consider investing in what's called silk pins, because sometimes dressmaking pins can be a little bit thick and they will actually put holes into your fabric. Again, like when we did the toile, I am pinning into the seam allowance so that we don't put holes into our fabric that we don't want. Okay, so that's that pattern piece now on there. So I'm just going to move off my weights because we don't need those on now. And now I'm going to go and I'm going to pin on the second piece, which is over the other side there. Still got my pattern weight on the bottom, look, holding that in place. But I'm going to do exactly the same thing now, and I'm going to measure the width of the fabric, make sure that it's straight, and then that will give me this lovely straight piece down the middle that we're going to use. So, using the same method again, just rewind the video if you need to see what I've done. But basically, you measure first to get your dimension across your fabric from your selvage edge to your folded edge, and weight it down so that it doesn't move, because otherwise you move one bit and the other bit moves. It's a bit like jelly, and we don't want that. We want to stabilise this. So by using your pattern weights, and these are lovely ones that I had from my friend Louise, painted stones, really nice. And you can, and then that will then hold it in place for you until you've got your pins in. Once you've got your pins in, so long as your fabric's still flat and you've not got any drag on it at the bottom, you'll be fine. So that's what we're wanting to do at this moment in time. I don't pin in the middle section of my pattern here, just around the edges, and I just stay within the seam allowance. Okay, so I'm just going to go pin my second panel. So this was my centre back. I'm just going to pin my centre front, and I'll come back to you and show you what we're going to do with this middle section. To quickie, you can also just measure the width of your pattern piece. So this is 9 1/4 for my pattern piece, and then as long as I do this selvage edge 10 1/4 or 10 1/2, then that's an easy way as well. You don't have to keep guessing. Just measure your pattern piece at the widest point, and that will also tell you how far you need to fold in your edge to give you this double amount of fold. Okay, so I've now got my front and my back using those folded edges, and they're all pinned in place. And now we've got this centre piece here that we can use. So the thing that I want to do now is have a look at my pattern pieces and see what will fit. Now the centre front and the centre back, we know of the band, we know need to be on a fold, so we can't use this front piece because it's not wide enough to fold it and to use it again. So let's just pop those to one side for a minute. However, your tier 1 panel hopefully is enough to reach in that middle piece. So we are going to do some mirroring of this pattern piece in order to get the best out of this fabric, because I can pop that up to the top up there and get, if I have one that, no, I can't use that way, can I? Because I want to have it, the fabric going all the way. So yeah, what I was just correcting myself then was I was thinking that if you've got a plain fabric like a linen, you could have one fabric piece that way, and you could have another fabric piece that way, and again those two fabric pieces would join into each other because of the shape of it. So one that way and one that way, and that the point of here would come into the point of there, and that would then line it out if it's a plain fabric. But mine's not, and I'm using my fabric all the same way so that some of it doesn't look upside down and some of it doesn't. And so with this one I will cut one out like that, and then I'll move that cut piece down, and I will flip it over, because this is a single fabric in the middle, so that I have one for the left with the pattern on the right side. And if I cut that one out the same direction, that point would be at the back, and I need the point at the front, so I have to flip the pattern piece over in order to do the other side. I hope that makes sense. There is a video on my channel about mirroring pattern pieces in relation to lunar lapping dolls that I make, but it's still relevant for this type of project too. Okay, so this one here can go up there, and I can cut 2 out there. The other thing as well is that tier 2 for mine will just fit across as well, and that's a single piece. So down this middle section I'll be able to get both pieces of tier 1 and both pieces of tier 2 out of this piece of fabric, and still having used both sides of the fold. Because if you think if we'd have only got one fold, we'd have had to have used the whole of this length and then the whole of that length again, because we only would have had, with a single fold of the fabric, would have only had a fold on one side, and we wouldn't have had a fold on the other. So that's why I'm trying to explain it to do it this way, because I think it does save fabric. It is slightly more complicated, but if you can embrace the explanation and it makes sense, and you can see what I'm trying to do with the selvage edges coming in only enough to cover these pattern pieces, then we can start and cut these pieces out. So we know that, because I can just lay that on top, put my finger and then get a point at which I can then lay another pattern piece and then another pattern piece. So I know all of those are going to fit pretty much with the length of my garment here. What I'm going to do then is, just moving my pattern weight so I don't lose those, is I'm now just, with these pinned pieces, I'm just going to fold my fabric over and take that weight off there and move this pattern up to the top. So that now gives me a new piece of fabric that hasn't had any folds on it yet to be working with, because we will end up cutting those pieces out first, but I don't want to start and cut anything out until I'm sure I've got enough fabric for doing everything I want to do, because we can adjust it before we make the garment, we can't adjust it afterwards. So the next thing that we're going to then look at doing is our next lot of pattern pieces, which is tier 3. So that's going to fit across there. And we actually have to cut 2 of those. So down the bottom here, so we say one there and then another one there, that will give us those 2. We've then got to cut out this one here, which is long, and we need 2 of those. So again, one of that. Let me move my fabric down again. And that's going to be approximately 2 of those. So at the moment I'm kind of walking through my pattern pieces on my fabric to make sure that we've got enough before I start to cut. So that's there. Then I can move my fabric up and we're getting towards the end. But I can see that even though I need to cut out 2 of these pieces here, so again another 1 and another 2, I've then still got enough to fit my bodice pieces onto the bottom here and be able to use the folds. And then the strap will come out of the centre section. So I'm comfortable that I've got enough fabric to make this dress. So now I'm going to take my pattern pieces off. I might even put those at the top actually, because they're on the fold, and while we've got those double folds that would make sense. But I'm now confident before we even start and cut this fabric out that we have got enough on here to make our dress. You also need to just make sure that you've got all of your pattern pieces as well before, so do a double check with your instructions and just make sure that you've got your 5 side tier pieces, you've got your front panel and your back panel, and you've got your front bodice and your back bodice, and you've got a pattern piece for your straps. And then you'll know you're all good to go then. So because we pinned that fabric earlier, we don't have to worry too much about that having shifted. So let's find where we were. So before we cut anything else out, I am just going to position the front and the centre back onto these pieces here as well, so that they just fit nicely. And I think this one's slightly wider than that one, so that's fine. And if not, then just, if it doesn't fit at this point, we're going to cut out some of the other pattern pieces first, and then you can then adjust it. So I do need to adjust that one slightly because that's just not quite fitting on there. But that one there will that one fit on there? No, both of them are just a bit too narrow. Just see if that one will fit on there. No, I'm going to lose it. I'm going to use my thing. So I am going to have to cut those out separately. So let's cut out, first of all, or pin on place, and I'll probably cut out the centre one pieces first, but we're going to have to just straighten those pieces up with the grain, so let's work on doing that next. So just smooth everything out, put your pattern weight at the bottoms again so that you don't lose your fabric off the edge of your table, and just straighten this out now. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is be working with our front here. And what we want to just make sure is that, depending on the pattern that you're using, just make sure you don't end up with targets on your bust. You want to just try and choose that pattern piece. So I probably wouldn't choose this big pink flower as being on that placement just there. I'd probably try and have it so that it's falling in the centre of this section here, which is more neutral. So that's all fine. So let me just have a quick look and just see. We haven't got a lot of fabric to play with to make sure that that happens, but just there should be fine over towards that side. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to put a pattern weight in the middle of our pattern piece just to hold it steady for us. And then remember those grain lines that we drew? We're going to put our tape measure first across the top of the grain line, and we're going to measure across to the edge, folded edge. And I'm just 21 inches and 2/8 of an inch there. Do use in centimetres if you want, it doesn't matter. And then here, I'm just under, so I know that this pattern piece is slightly twisted. So I straighten it up slightly and measure again at the top, and that's smack on 21, and that's off on 21. So I know that we're not quite right still. So 21.1, 21.1, right, I'm in the right place. So now I'm going to pin this pattern piece in place. I'm then going to be radical, and we're going to cut out this pattern piece because I need the fabric, the pattern, again, for the next piece that I'm going to be cutting out. But we know we've got enough fabric, so we can do that with confidence. So this is, I'm just pinning it through one layer of the fabric at this moment in time, all the way around in the seam allowance as we would do normally. And just make sure you've got enough pins just to feel comfortable that when we start to cut this out, it's going to be in the right place. Okay, so that's, I'll take my pattern weight off the centre now. Got all of my other pieces are all straight, and I'm just making sure, just put your hands over it and just run your fingers along. You don't want any creases or be able to feel any of your fabric ruckling up underneath your pattern. And then we're going to take our scissors, and I'm going to cut this pattern piece out now. So let's just take this one, and I'm cutting right up to the edges, but not taking off any of the paper at all. And I try not to go too far past the edges of my pattern piece, because we never know how closely up we're going to want to be butting another pattern piece, and therefore that's important. You can use a rotary cutter to cut out your pattern pieces, but you would need to have a self-healing mat underneath, like the green one that I took off my desk, underneath before you start to start to cut out, otherwise you will damage your tabletop. Now at this point, if your fabric is a single colour, say like a linen, and it's not got a right side or a wrong side, then just bear in mind that sometimes there are slight differences that you may not see on first look. So I'm taking this pattern piece off because I need to use it again straight away to do my second piece just here. And this fabric has got a very clear right side and a wrong side, so I know I won't get mixed up because that's much more muted than the right side. But if you are working with one that's where you can't tell the difference, I take a pin and I will just, in the seam allowance somewhere, leave a pin in on a double in out, if you like. Let me just show you at the camera. There's my pin on a double in out, and that will tell me that that's the right side of that piece of fabric. So I'm going to pop this piece of fabric to one side and put it somewhere deliberate so it's not going to get mixed up with your scrap pieces, because you don't want to then go and test your tension of your sewing machine onto a piece that you think is scrap and you later find out it was the only piece that you could have in that fabric. So next I'm taking my pattern piece, which we've just cut out this way round. I'm now going to flick it over and move it down, and I can see my grain line through. So let's put that pattern weight on the top again. I just want to make sure I've not got a big flower on the side of my bust, which is going to be on this bit here. Smooth it down, take measure again, top of your grain line across to the edge. In this case, I'm just under 17 inches. And then to the bottom of the grain line and I'm way off. That's nowhere near straight, okay? So then I can just take it and straighten it up a little bit. And this is why sometimes we're working at some strange angles. So we need to make sure that we're getting these pattern pieces straight. So that's 17, just under 17 and a half. Let's try this piece. And that's 17 and a quarter. So I know that bottom edge just needs to go out slightly with the top staying pretty much where it is. Like that. And this will all help with the hang of the dress. That's just under 17 and a half. And this one now is just under 17 and a half. So now, with my weight still on it, I can use my pins and I can pin this piece down. It's essential that you've turned your pattern piece over. I know I keep saying that, but if you've not got enough fabric and you've cut it out one way, then you're going to be in trouble, and I don't want you to be in trouble, because it'll always be my fault. And I don't want it to be my fault. Okay. So here we go. And if you've chosen a fabric that's got a stripe to it, then generally speaking, you will need to buy extra fabric to be able to match your stripes as well, because on the length it's not so bad, but if it's stripy across, then you've got to have this side of your panel, the stripes on this side have got to match in the same place, and so as the front panel here to go across, unless you're doing your front panel on the diagonal. But yeah, that I would steer away from try and get a nice easy pattern on your fabric to work with first off, just while you're learning, and then you can expand your repertoire into all sorts of lovely fabrics after that. So that's now in place. I've taken my pattern weight off. So again, let's cut out this pattern piece just here now, fabric piece, just making sure, and I'm making sure there's no pull on my fabric. I'm not lifting my fabric up with my hand. I'm running my scissor blade along the table underneath so that I can cut this out. Little flat piece at the top of the bodice there that we just cut straight across. Okay, just down this side. Okay, so that's our second piece cut. So now I will take out this pattern piece off here, because we've cut those two out singularly. So pins out, oops, pull that slightly. I'm now going to get my other pattern piece of fabric, the one that we've already cut out, and I'm going to lay it so that it's the same orientation and match the edges up. And if this second piece was a plain fabric, I would also mark that one with a pin to say that that one is the right side that I'm using. And then I'd put the right sides together for the fabric, match up all of your corners, make sure that's all straight, and then I have to go that orientation, don't me turn that over, and then take your pattern and then put that back over the top of it. And just secure it down in a few places, because we've got some notches that we need to mark onto our pattern, onto our fabric pieces. So this is going to be for the next step that we need. So we might as well do it now, and that makes sure that that other piece doesn't get lost in our scraps when we start cutting everything out. So just make sure you've got everything in line. And then pop your pattern piece, your fabric pieces onto your pile of cut fabric. I often put it onto my chair, just so that I know where it is. So that's one piece cut out already. Okay, just make sure everything's just staying straight for you. So the next thing that I want to then cut out is tier 2, because on mine I can fit my tier 2 piece out of this central part here. If you need a bit of extra width, you might have to cut out your front and back panel first before you then can start and cut out your tier 2. But I know that I need 2 of those, and they're a perfectly rectangular shape, so I can cut one out and then put it on top of the other one and cut the second one out. So let's just start and have a look at that. But I've got a grain line again, so we're going to be using our grain line again. So I'm just making sure everything's all nice and straight. Come down a little bit so that we've not got any little nicks in our fabric from where we've cut out previously. And then I'm going to use my tape measure to measure, oh, where's my, put a pattern weight in the middle just to help you hold it still, from the grain line across. So that's 20 1/4. On mine, it'll be different on yours, and that's just under, so that's not quite straight. Just pull that bottom out slightly. And I'm sticking to the paper. 20 1/4. 20 1/4. So I'm happy that that piece is straight. So here I've just got to go, just tuck under the selvage edge. So I'm just going to fold that selvage edge back slightly, and I'm now just going to pin down these sides whilst the pattern weight is holding it steady for me. And I'm making sure that the writing on my pattern pieces is up to the top. So always make sure that your writing that you put on your traced pattern pieces tells you which way up is the top of your pattern piece, because if you put your writing upside down, then you'll confuse yourself when it comes to actually cutting that piece out, and the resultant notches might be in the wrong place, because we've got we've got a notch here, and then we've got 2 notches down there for our clues as to how to join it together. So we want to make sure that those are together and that on the right sides, otherwise your fabric piece will end up upside down. So there's that one there. One more pin needed. Oops, trying to get on my desk. And there's just one in the middle there. So I'm going to cut this piece out now that I'm happy that's straight, take my pattern weight off. Cut that piece out now, and I'm going to move it down into the space underneath, and I'm going to do the same again and cut another one out of this. I don't need to flick it over because it's a rectangle shape. It's not got any, it's not asymmetrical. It's not got, it's the both, whether it's up or down, it's in both the same direction, so that'll be fine. And then we'll come back and we'll cut out the 2 long panels, the front and the back, and then I'll join you again when I'm moving my fabric up and we start to refold it for attaching our next pieces of fabric, next piece of pattern. Okay, so I'm off to cut this piece out and the next one, and then I'll come back to you. Okay, so we've cut out centre front panel and the centre back panel. We've cut out both mirror copies of tier 1, and we've cut out tier 2 as well. They're all on my chair out of the way. The next pieces I'm going to concentrate on is the centre front of the band here and the centre back of the same band but at the back. So we're going to do that same configuration of folding the 2 selvage edges into the middle. So I've got those 2 selvage edges here, but they just needed to be slightly wider than we'd allowed for on the original cutting out. Now the reason why I didn't alter those side panels in is because I wanted that nice long length next to the side panels to be there for cutting out those tiers out of the middle. And I hope that, depending on the sizes, you've been able to do that same with your fabric as well. If not, message me and I'll try and help you using the comments if I can to suggest a different way. Or follow the layout guide in the pattern instructions if you can, with the way that they folded things. So this time I've got my weights on the bottom just to hold my fabric out of the way, and I've got my fabric pieces here. I do tend to cut off, if it's not very wide, I do tend to cut off the scraps and just put those out of the way so they don't get in the way. And then this time I'm going to take one piece at a time, and I'm going to cut out one piece from the front here. So I need to be able to move my pattern, my fabric over so that it's enough for this piece to go on the fold, and to cut that out without using the selvage edge. So that's one piece there. Let me just put my pattern piece on to hold that, and then I'll come round to this other side way. Perhaps should have had rounded corners on my desk, shouldn't I? And then on this side here, hopefully you can still see me, then I just need to take that slightly narrower, because again we try and preserve as much of the fabric as we can do. That one's okay. Just make sure that's lying nicely. And then again, but just try and be aware of where the pattern placement is. You know, you might not want a big flower that's off centre, so you can play with the width of this in order to try and get that so that it's right. By right, I just mean to however you want it to be, because you can just put your pattern piece straight on it, and that's fine too. It just depends on where you want that pattern placement to be. If you've got a plain fabric, which as I said is a good idea when you're making something for the first time, then that's always a good idea too. Right, so let's put our down a little bit more. Right, so I'm happy with those two pieces now. So again, I'm trying to use the full width before I try and use the length of my fabric. So let me make sure this is now on the edge and sits straight. So down to final placement. Okay, happy with that piece. So I'm going to pin these pieces on now, and then I'm going to cut this out. If I'd have been, just as a quick tip, if I'd have been able to just fold my fabric in half with my selvage edges down to one side, I wouldn't have cut any pieces out at all until I was absolutely sure I got every single pattern piece pinned onto my fabric to make sure I got everything. But because of the way that this pattern is drafted, to get the best out of the fabric, then you just need to make these little bits and adjust it as you go along. But hopefully in the earlier sections of the video I've shown you how to make sure that you've got enough fabric roughly before you start to actually cut this fabric out. So let's just put these bits on here. Just make sure there's no creases under your fabric and that your pattern is lying flat on your fabric. You don't want it twisting at all. And I've used the fold line here to make sure that my pattern is straight on there. It's just such a small piece that it's fairly straightforward, unless it's got a stripe on. If your fabric's got a stripe on it, then you'll need to be really precise as well. So once I've got these pattern pieces just held on, then I'm going to go back and I'm then going to cut these two pieces out, and then we've just got the straps and the remaining 3 tiers to cut out, but we'll talk about those in a second when we get onto that bit. Okay, so at this stage now I've got tier 3, tier 4 and tier 5 to cut out, and my straps piece. So I'll put my straps piece to one side for the moment, and we're going to concentrate on the other tiers now. So what I'm going to do for this section is I'm going to put the 2 sides of the selvages together and refold what's left of my fabric. And if I hold it up like this, we can start and see if the fabric is lying straight, because if you go like that with it, just take it slightly off to show you. You can see I'm getting creases at the bottom and it's not wanting to lie flat. And if I just sort of straighten it up a bit, that I can get all of those fibres just to lie nice and flat. So that's how I generally fold my fabric first. Make sure you've still got it the same way up that you had it before. And I know that I've cut from the other edge of my selvage edge, so I know that that's off, and this is my remaining overlocked edge, so I know where that one is. So now I'm just putting it together so that the edges are now completely together of the fabric, and we've just got a single fold along this far edge. You can see how fluid this fabric is, can't you, when I'm just manoeuvring it. So let me just get it just so it's over the edge of the desk, but then I'm going to just put a weight on it just to hold it so it doesn't fall off. So that's going to hold it together. So just straighten it up just nicely. And there we go. Okay, so let's just have a go at pattern placement now and just see how we get on with these. So we've got to cut out 2 of each of these. So we know if we pop this one, which is tier 3, up towards the top just there, then we know we're going to have 2 of those because we're cutting out on the double. This one here though, tier 4, won't fit all the way across my fabric, look, it's off the edge here. So what I'm actually going to do is take that pattern piece and I'm going to fold it in half. So make sure your corners are on top of each other. Just take that pin out for a second. Because then I can cut out one of these at a time and I can cut out 1, 2 of that one. So I'll be happy with that. And then with this long one as well, tier 5, which is super long, I've also done the same thing. I've found its halfway point and cut it in half. And then I can pop that on my fabric, and I've got enough fabric to cut 2 out of those as well. So that's fine. Now my straps piece here needs to follow along the grain, and that will slot in just nicely at the end there, because some of these pieces are on the fold. So I'll put my fold that edge, haven't I? And it needs to go this edge, because that needs to have 2 cut on the fold like that. So let's have a look and see. So I'm going to have one there and one there, that's fine. And then I can repeat that going down. But what I might do, it's just now just about pattern placement in terms of just getting the bit out. I've got more than enough fabric down the end here for what I need to cut out, so that's great, because that might mean that I might get a top out of this fabric as well. Might be able to make a little tank top version of this top. That's another option, isn't it? So let me put some weights down the bottom here so this doesn't start disappearing off the edge of the desk. And I'm going to now, I'll tell you what, I'll put my strap that side instead, I think. No, I can go up into this fabric here. So this is what I mean, it's just a bit of a fabric jigsaw puzzle. So because of the way I've cut out the fabric at the top here, I've got a small amount of fabric here that is folded over, and that will be enough that I can put my pattern piece down here, just down in this bit here, because that's all double and I need that to be double. That's where I cut out the backs from between the 2 side panels, so I can keep that nice and straight, and then that one there will fit on there and that will fit nicely. Okay, yes, happy with that. Just move this down slightly. See, it starts to slip as soon as I take those weights off. Just so it's straight. Just put the weights back on again just to hold it. And then we're going to measure our grain line. So I'm just trying to make sure that these fibres in this viscose are as straight as possible on the fold. And then I'm going to use my tape measure again when I find it. Where have I put that? Oh, it's on the floor. And so pattern weight in the centre of my strap, and then I'm going to measure out from the grain line to the edge, and it's about 3/4 of an inch. So let's just put a pin in the end there just to hold that in place. And I can measure further along here. Just take that further to the fold. Get that to 3/4 of an inch. Then up to the end up here, and just manipulate my fabric until I'm 3/4 of an inch there. So that'll give us some nice long straight straps. So let's just put some more pins in there to hold those in place. So I hope this layout guide, this way of laying the fabric out is working for you too. As I say, I do think it just gets the more fabric out of your, more pattern out, more dress out of your fabric panels. And that's what we're wanting to do with this, is we're wanting to make sure that we've got as much as we can out of our fabric, because it leaves us more for another project. So when I'm cutting this section here, because of the way that the shaping is on the other pieces, I just need to make sure that I go down far enough to miss where that's been cut into. So I need to just take that down slightly. So let's put our pattern piece on top, our weight on top there, and then I'm going to measure from the top of the grain line to the fold. support it with my dress. So just under 18, and then to the bottom here, just under 18, that's straight. So let's pin this piece in place now. And then once I've pinned this in place, then I'll move down and we'll start and work on the other pieces here. Because again, I'm trying to use up all of the scraps and all of the width of the fabric I can at the top end before then we start to use up anything that we might need further down. Just makes, if you just get into the habit of doing that, it just means it's just a little bit more economical on your fabric for you. And if that's not a concern to you, then that's absolutely fine. But for some people, I'm sure it will be. It's just so expensive, isn't it, as fabric is sometimes. So, and we certainly don't dressmake to save money, do we, generally? I think generally it's because we like the fit more than anything else. So we want to preserve that money for putting onto other projects. Okay, so I'm happy with that now. So if I'm careful, I can just pull this up now so that that pattern piece then disappears over the edge nice and straight. So that's good. And then we're on to cutting our pattern pieces out here. So as I said, this piece here won't fit across all of my fabric. It's off the edge here. So that's why I've just folded it in half and then I'll cut it out twice instead. So let me just move this just down slightly so I can see the edge of my fabric. So now I can use the fold edge just here. I can pin that pattern piece on, make sure, yes, I got it the right way up, because we need to know for our notches that we're going to be putting into our fabric pieces later. And make sure you've got one on top of the other perfectly as well, because these are just rectangles, so these don't need to be mirrored. You can just cut out to the same orientation, but you just need to make sure that you've got your top and your bottom cut lines on top of each other. As I said, each time you cut it out, you'll shave a little bit more off it, and it'll make your dress smaller and smaller each time you make it. One on there. Let's now do this one. So you can either fold them on top of each other, or once you've got your fold line where you know you're working to, then you can fold it out like that. And as long as your folded edge is on the folded edge of the other one, then you're fine. And this one's nearly the full width, look, isn't it? Just pin that to the corner, to the fold to start off with, and then just work your way along it. Enough pins so that you're comfortable that it's not going to pull for you. So I'm now going to cut out all of this above here, because then we can come back again and put these two pattern pieces further down and cut those out. So let's just move this fabric back down, and I can get to my straps and to this section here, and then just put some pattern weights on just to hold it so it doesn't start to pull on your fabric. And we will go through a pattern piece check as well to make sure that we've not missed any pieces out. And if you've got a particularly long section from here, just remember to add extra onto your straps if you need it. You know, when you're doing your pattern adjustments, then just make sure that you've got enough length on your straps as well. Okay, straps, that goes on my chair, out of the way. And then let's cut out this next section. Okay, so once I know that I've fulfilled that pattern requirement, so that's a complete piece of tier 3, there's 2 pieces there because the fabric's on a double. So I'll put that one onto my chair because that's now finished. But these 2 pattern pieces we need to cut out additional copies for. So when I finish with these, I won't put them on my chair, I'll keep them on my tabletop so that I remember that I've got to cut out some more of those ones. So let's just move this fabric back up so I can reach it, and let me just pop that across. So you can see I've got half of my pattern piece on the over the edge from the halfway point so that I know where I am. So then let's just go from here. Piece there needs to go just there because I need to cut another piece out of that. This piece piece here also needs to go on top here because I need another copy of bit out of that. So then let's move the fabric back up here. Make sure the raw edges stay together because that's where we want them to be because we cut that other piece out. Just make sure that's right. And then again we can now put our fabric pieces on top here, making sure it's still the fabric's still the right way round. And I've still got my fabric piece underneath there, but you can take it out if you want to. Just make sure you're not going to snip anything off that you want to keep. That one on. And then if I take my other one that we want to do that, make sure my writing's the right way up. Yep, that's the right way up. Just got that one right up against it. And if you look, I've put this one, the smaller one, down because this fabric here is going to continue to be a piece of this fabric. And so if by not sort of putting it as a square on its own, then it joins that section. So if I need that for something else, then I've got it. Again, it depends on how fussed you are about saving fabric, but it's become a bit of a mantra for me. So let's just put these pins through all of here. Okay, so let's cut these two pieces out now. This should be the final two pieces. Still got half a metre of fabric left, I would say, out of mine. So I've actually managed to get the whole dress, which is a size 16, just shortened out of 2.5 metres of fabric probably. So that's really good because because we've got all of that together now. So just put these two pattern pieces, now that we've finished those, onto your chair. But just locate your two bodice pieces again, because I want to talk to you about lining these. So to get a nice neat finish on the inside of your dress, then the bodice is actually lined, and that gives you a way of putting the front and the back together and enclosing all of the seams on the inside neatly. So if you have a light fabric, light in colour, so like I did with my other one, I'm pointing to it but you can't see it, then had I have used the same fabric as my lining, then some of those colours would have shown through on the front, because some of the colours are strong, like the red and the green. Let me just get it for you and I can show you. So on here, if I'd have used the same colour as this to have lined my fabric, you would have got a shadow of the colours underneath the bodice. And so instead on this one, I actually used a plain white fabric. I think it was either sheeting or from a pillowcase. But I just used that underneath in order to line that top piece, so it gave me the two layers. The same on this one as well, because I got the big turquoise blue flowers, I didn't want that to show through, and so I've used a different fabric for that. Ideally, if this was you, I would suggest that if you, like this fabric here would be okay, I would use the same fabric again to line this. I'm not today because I want to be able to show you the contrast so you know when I'm working on the lining and when I'm not. But for your purposes, you could go ahead now and cut out a second piece of this fabric here for the front and for the back, which is your front here and your back there, not your straps, don't need to do your straps, in order that you've got your lining pieces. But I'm going to find a contrast fabric that I can use for that so that you can see what I'm working with. So let me just fold this fabric up and put this out the way. I do tend to cut off any long, thin, straggly pieces, but we will save a small piece of the scraps in order to practice our tension. The other thing is, if you like making scrunchies and things like that, you can use some of this fabric as well to make a matching scrunchie or a headband to go with your dress if you wanted to. And sometimes you can even make a matching purse, can't you? Little handbag or something, little crossbody bag or something. So there's ways of using up these scraps of fabric, but I just tend to cut off anything that's not part of the main that might not be useful in the future, and then I pop this into my fabric stash and I can use that for something else. But for today, I'm going to find a fabric. Let me just go and have a look in my scraps and see what I've got. And I'm going to use a fabric, a different contrast fabric, so that when I'm sewing it up, you can clearly tell which is the lining and which is the outer. I'll be back in a second. Okay, so I've actually found a bit of this plain white just cotton sheeting that I've got. So I'm just going to fold that in half now. I'm going to measure again to make sure that I've got my fabric in half and to make sure that that's right. So let's just put a pattern piece on to make sure that we've got the right amount that we need first. So I can take that slightly less. Okay, that might work. Let's just have a look and see. So now let's fold this across. Let's put that just onto 11. Yep. And down here just onto 11 as well, just to make sure that that's as right as we can be. And that's how we make sure that our fabric's on straighter grain, because that's important. And then we can take our pattern pieces. In this case, I'm just going to take my fabric off my pattern piece. And again, because the way I've folded it, I'm just going to turn my pattern piece upside down so that it fits onto the fabric in the right orientation. So I've got the folded edge against the fold, and then matching my folded edge here up to the edge of there. Just make sure, I need to go down slightly, I've got a little bit cut out. That's the trouble sometimes if you're using a scrap. Just make sure that all of your pattern piece is actually on the fabric. As I say, you could do this the same fabric as your main dress if you want to, absolutely fine, just as long as you make sure there's no shadow from the print underneath it. So cut that piece out first. Keep your piece separate, your piece that you've already cut out, to one side, because you need to join those two pieces, to not join them together, you need to layer them so that you've got them all together. And this piece, don't let them get caught up in your scraps, especially if you've got children around or you're expecting visitors. It's so easy to forget. Okay, I'll just cut these two lining pieces out, and then we'll be talking about interfacing, and we'll be cutting out our interfacing. Okay, so I've cut out my lining. So I've got my lining piece and my fashion fabric piece for both my front and my back. Just put those to one side at the moment. Just make sure they're all the same orientation. And remember on your back that the narrow piece at the top here, there's a slanted edge there on opposite the fold. The fold edge is straight. But then if I put it on the work surface here, you can see this comes out at the bottom. So this edge here is longer than this edge here. So when you put them together with your fabric, make sure you've got that the right way round. Because the next thing we're going to do is cut out our interfacing. So I've got some interfacing here, and the kind that I'm using here is a woven, and it's an iron-on. So on one side you've got some little knobbles, and that's knobbles of glue, and on the other side it's nice and smooth. And what this is going to do is it's going to just give some structure to the front panels and also to the straps, in order that it reduces any stretch in that area if there's any in the fabric, which there shouldn't be, but it's minimal, but it still can do that. But it kind of stabilises everything. It stabilises all of those fibres. And so what we're going to do with that, and you can buy this online, this is a lightweight iron interfacing, and depending on your fabric, you can either use a super lightweight, but I think lightweight is better. Super lightweight I'd probably use with silk and that type of fabric, but this lightweight will be just nice, just to give it some structure to the fabric and make it work quite nicely. So there's a grain on the fabric in terms of how it pulls apart and what have you. So again, try and work with the grain of this, and then we're going to just put our pattern pieces onto. Well, that was lucky, wasn't it? It's exactly the right size. And then we're going to just pin our pattern pieces for our bodice, top and bottom. Oops. And then I'll need to find my straps pattern as well, and I will put that onto our interfacing as well. So just pin that onto your interfacing, and then we're going to this is the back piece, that needs to be that way around because of the fold. So I can put that right up to save space again. So just going to pin that onto our fabric, making sure that we've got our fold straight. Again, so you can measure across if you want to. And probably should at this beginner stage. I know I can see that mine's straight enough, so I'm not going to worry too much. And then once we've got that pinned on, I'm just going to cut those two out. I'm also going to locate my straps piece, and I believe the straps are interfaced as well. And then once you've cut out your interfacing pieces, just take your pins out again. It's taking pins in and out all the time, isn't it? But it's what we need to do. Stack your lining on top of your fashion fabric for your front, and then you're going to put your interfacing and your pattern piece on top as well, and just pin that together again, just to hold that in place in a couple of places. So that's quite a thick little package now with fabric pieces, and the same with your back as well. Just line those up and then just pop those on top of each other. And then you can breathe a huge sigh of relief because you've actually finished cutting out all of your fabric that you need for your dress. So the next thing that we're just going to do is mark our notches, so that we've got those all ready. And I'll probably just fuse my, no, this video's long enough. We'll do that in the next section. We'll mark our notches now, because I mentioned that in the intro, and then we will then come back to fuse our interfacing onto the back of our pattern pieces that we've got, our fabric pieces, and then we will then start construction in the next video. So I'll just turn the camera around. I'm a bit hot and sticky, but I'll turn the camera around. Okay, so we've all finished cutting out now, hopefully, and I just wanted to now show you what we do with the notches, because we're going to do that at this stage now, so that on part 4, I think will be, then we'll be on to just fusing our interfacing onto our fabrics where we need to, and then we can start sewing and get the prep done. So that'll be the exciting bit. But today, give yourself a round of applause if you've managed to work with this amount of fabric for the first time, because it's not for the faint-hearted. So you've done really well, and because we've got this lovely big skirt, we've got quite a lot of fabric. But the steps we're going to take to sew it together are fairly straightforward, and so we can, hopefully you'll find that you're repeating the same technique over and over again, and that will actually get you familiar with it. Anyway, I digress. As always, I digress. Right, so let's just separate our pattern pieces into 3 piles so that we've got everything we need. So on the first pile, I want you to have all of your band front pieces, all of your band back pieces, and your straps. Okay, so that's your first pile that we're going to be working with. The second pile, I want you to have your centre front panel, and I want you to have your centre back panel. Okay, so you should have just one at each of those, both cut on the fold. So that's those 2 pieces, that's our second pile. And then on our third pile, we've got all of our tiers. So we've got tier 1, which is the shaped one. I'll put that face down so I can pick it up the other way around. We've got our 2 pieces cut out for tier 2. So that's the 2 pieces there. We've then got our tier 3, and we've got 2 pieces cut out for tier 3. I'll fold that in half for now. Now, tier 4 and tier 5 we cut on the fold, didn't we? Whereas it's actually the pattern pieces on the single. So we're going to work with tier 4 first, so just put that to one side. So put tier 5 to one side, let's work on tier 4. I just want you to take the pins out that are holding the pattern piece onto tier 5, because tier 5 is quite long, if you remember. And we've got 2 pieces that are shorter because they're folded in half. And making sure you've got your fabric the right way up, I want you to open them out so that you put one face side up, and the other one, making sure you don't twist your fabric over, we're going to put face side down, so that when you look at your fabric, you've got, we can't see on there, can you? When you've got your fabric, you've got the 2 right sides together and the 2 wrong sides are poking out. So then what we can start and do is match that onto our pattern piece along the top edge. So just match your corners first. This is the way I tend to manage to match that. And then as you work down your pattern piece, without pulling your fabric, you're just going to match the pattern up to the raw edge, this top raw edge of your fabric. Because what we're just doing, we're just reinstating that pattern in the correct orientation for this skirt. And if you've got a bigger desk than that, because I've put my desk down now from a cutting table, so either on the floor or wherever you're working, or your kitchen table, or kitchen islands are perfect as well for this kind of project as well, for cutting out. As long as nobody wants to be fed, that is. If they want to be fed, then they're on a hide into nothing, aren't they? And my fabric's grown slightly on the end here. But just put that on so that you've got the pattern laid on. So you're just putting your paper pattern piece back on top of your fabric so that that's all together. And then you can then just give it a little shake, and that should then allow you to then put your pattern piece on, and you can then match up the bottom edge as well. Because we're going to need these pins in to mark the fabric, the notches on our fabric at the end. On that pattern piece, and then you're going to then pop that onto the pile with your side tiers again. So you've got all of that together. And then you're going to take your tier 5 and you're going to do exactly the same. And then I'm going to come back to you when I'm ready, and when we're ready to start to mark the notches. Okay, so I've got my 3 piles all ready. 1, 2, 3, one's out of sight. There's no notches on your strap, so we don't need to do anything. That can just go to one side. We're then going to work on the back piece. Now, we've got a notch on the top edge, and we know it's the top edge because this is angled just here. So we're going to locate our notch on the top edge. Now, the way that we mark notches is I usually use a smaller blade than my big scissors, because you don't want to put your scissors right the way across and then press hard and then find that you've shot across with your blade and you've cut a hole in your fabric. So you only want to be using the point. If you're using big scissors, because that's all you've got, then just make sure you just use the tip of them. Don't cut like that where you've got your blade right across. Just get used to just doing a little snip on top of the little T mark, and then you're going to snip through all of your layers of fabric at that point. Okay, I'm going to revert back to my snips because I know I prefer those. The next thing I want you to do is at the centre back, through all 3 layers, just do a little snip as well. And if you ask him what depth you want to go through, if you think that your seam allowance is 1 centimetre, then you want to go through maybe 1/3 of that way. You don't want to go all the way through the whole centimetre, because then you will then be at risk of cutting into your actual garment rather than just your notch stay as a clue in your seam allowance. So we've got a little notch on the top there. I would also, there isn't one marked, but I would also put one on the bottom edge of the centre back, because we can then use that as well as a good reference point. So I've just put a little snip through each one of those. And when you are working with your fabric, once you've got a snip in, let me just show you. Then, oh, this is a better one, look, because you have different colour fabric. So then you can then see that little snip, because it's very deliberate, and you can see that snip in your fabric when you're working with it, and it works very well. So you've got one on the top edge there, and I've one at the centre back, and I've added an extra one at the bottom of the centre back as well. So that's all you need on that one. And then on your front, the only one that we need is halfway along this bottom, well, not halfway, but along this bottom edge. Well, I say only one you need, I'm going to add some extra ones in, but the only one that's marked is along that edge. Just try and make sure all of your edges are together so that you're going to go through all of them as you snip. And that's got that little snip in. And then again, I want you to just put a little notch in at the centre front on each one as well, just a small way in, because I think that one will be really handy. There is a notch marked as well on the centre at the top, so you can just put that one in too. So that's 3. So one on the bottom edge here, away from the curved edge, and then top and bottom of the centre front I want you to mark. So that's all on our bodice pieces. So keep those separate to one side, because again, we're going to work on the dressing sections, and the bodice will be the first thing that we work on this band here in the straps. Okay, the next part that we will end up working on is our tiers. So let's mark those. So let's get this curved one first that we've got to do. And there's one on this point here at the underarm. So again, just make sure you've got both of your pieces of fabric together, you go through both of those. And then there's also one on this bottom hem edge as well. So let's snip that. So, oh, and we've got two over the back, over the side here as well. So on the side seam, on this bit just here, we've got two notches there. So let's just mark those in. 1 and 2. So just make sure you've got your snips. Make sure you've caught through both set pieces of your fabric. Sometimes we've had the pattern on and off a few times, so sometimes they become misaligned. So let's pop that to one side. Somewhere where you're not going to snip through it with the other thing, when you're doing the others. Let's get tier 2 now. And there's one on the tier 2 at the top, which we can just snip. And then there's 3 on the bottom. So there's one there, and one there. That's so 1 on the top edge here, and 3 on the bottom for tier 2. So let's just stack that on top of tier 1, and if I put them face side down, then they'll be the right way up when I turn them over. And staying organised on a dressmaking pattern is really important, and that's why you'll see I keep in my pattern pieces attached to the actual fabric pieces at all times until they become a part of the main garment, because then that's my clue as to what they are, which way round they need to go, and keeping it all together at the moment is key. So again, let's go on to this one here, which is tier 3. And now we've got 3 on the top. So that's one there, and one here. So that's 3 on the top just there. And then we've actually got 3 on the bottom as well. So let's do one just there, one just there, and one just there. Okay, so now let's pop that onto our pile of our tiers. And then we've got tier 4. So open that one up. And we've got 3 on the top of here again. Just make sure you're getting through both at the same time. Just mark them. One there, one there. And again, just using the edge of my snips just to cut through. 1, 2, 3. And then on the bottom edge, we've got 3 as well. So let's do one there, one there, and one there. And just make sure that you've not missed your bottom layer, because it's very easy, as I say, when you've been having these fabrics on and off your pattern pieces, it's very easy to miss one, and it's much easier to do them at this stage than it is to do them later, to try and go back and retro put those dots in, those notches in. And your notches are just, on this dress particularly, are just going to make sure you get your gathers right. So it's going to make so that the side panels are all gathered. So where your side panels are all gathered here, it's going to make sure that you've got an equal number of gathers on the front as on the back. And so by matching the notches up with the tier in front, you'll make sure you've got the same length of fabric to gather up and to match into those sections. So that's why that's important. Oops. Back in there. And then let's just do tier number 5. And this is where we have to be careful that we don't cut through anything that we don't want to when we're laying all of this out. So there's none on the bottom hem at all. They're all just on this top hem. So one just there, one. I think there's 3 again, isn't there? Those 2 pieces of fabric weren't quite lined up. That's 2. Another one just here. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So let's just get our 3 piles together. So that's tier 4, so tier 5, tier 4, tier 3, tier 2, tier 1. So that's one pile. Our front and, oh, we've got to our front and our back. Nearly forgot. So let's get these out then. So let's just work on the top one first. Which one have I got first? So I'm working with my centre back first. And then what we've got here, well, let me just turn it so that I've not got the folded edge towards me. And where's my snips? Oh, lost my snips. Hold on 1 second. I'll put them away. Anybody else do this? Spend time trying to find things? I've got them. I found them. They were hiding. So let's have a look at our centre back then. This is what I'm working on. So working from the top down, we've got 2 at the side just here, so let's put those 2 in. Then 1 just below that, another 1 just below that. Just make sure you don't try and cut through pins because scissor blades and pins don't mix. Another one there, and another one just down at the bottom here. So these notches on the side panels here will mark where the gathered tiers hit the front and the back here, and we want those to be even. So that's why these notches are really important. And you've also got a notch at the centre back as well. So mark that one. None others on there. Don't have to put any notches on the hem, so that's okay. And then on here we've got our centre front. And then we've got a notch at the centre front on the fold, so just put a little notch in there. And then there's 1 on the side just there, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, so that's all good then. Okay, now we're finished. So that's our 2 top panels. We've got our bodice panels, our front and back panel, and then we've got our side tier panels. So we're all organised now. So let me just tip the camera just slightly up more and then I can talk to you for a second. So well done for sticking with me if you've got this far. Cutting out can be quite tricky in some ways because you've got to be thinking all the time about your pattern placement, your paper pattern, the design of your fabric as well if there is one, so that you're not ending up with target boobs or, you know, a centre target on a crotch if you're making trousers. And you've just got to think carefully about how you want those lines to interact or that design to interact with your pattern. And so you start to understand then how complicated actually making your own clothes can be to a certain extent, but you can always make it simple by choosing one single colour fabric. That's always a good option. Or something with a pattern like a polka dot that doesn't then matter whereabouts that pattern placement is, or, you know, like the floral when it's not directional up or down. So also working with this amount of fabric as well can be a little tricky, and we've got a few pattern pieces going on here, so that's why I'm just trying to give you those tips to stay organised right from the very beginning so that we know where we are. And if I'm dressmaking, then generally I'll choose my pattern and I'll do my PDF if I'm doing that, or I do my tracing. That's one section of, I think of these as like different sections. So getting your pattern together, buying it, purchasing it, printing it out, sticking it together, tracing it off. That's kind of like one section together. The next section then is cutting out, and in this case, the notches too. So because you have to generally have everything all laid out, and you have to have just some time to yourself to be able to think about what you're doing and paying attention to if you've got to mirror any pieces, if you're having to cut any out on the single, or the best layout to get the fabric, to make the fabric work for you as best as possible. That's important too. And making sure you don't miss any pattern pieces. So that's why I keep doing those checks all the way through. Have we got the 5 tiers going down? Have we got our straps and our 2 bodice pieces? You know, all the way along the line, and then our front and our back piece. Have we got all of those all ready to go? Because, you know, you don't want to get all your fabric put away and then find you've got to go and get it out again because you've forgotten to cut something out. So that's why this video is going to be a long one, and I apologise, I'm sorry but I'm not sorry as well, because I think that if you've not cut out and worked with this size of fabric before, then it is important. And also with this dress, because there is a way of cutting it out with that double fold, which is, you know, slightly different to what you might have done before, then it takes time to explain things. If you were to make this dress again, you would still follow that same process, but because you were already used to it and you've already done all of the 12 fitting and the pattern testing, you can miss out part 1 and part 2. You jump straight into the cutting out, so you already save time when you come to make this dress a second, a third, a fourth time. And so that's why you find that some people will make the same pattern 3 or 4 times in different fabrics or different lengths, or if it's a sleeved dress, different sleeve options. Because all that time you're learning that pattern and those techniques, and the more times you do it, the more natural it comes and the easier it comes. So I just want you to remember that although it's felt quite laborious to start at talking about the pattern and then talking about pattern changes and doing the toile, that's all done now. So next time you want to make this dress, you go out and buy your fabric, you get it washed and dried, you're straight at the cutting out stage. And then next time we're going to start and put the interfacing onto our fabric with our irons, and then we're going to start actually doing the sewing. So we're going to sew the bodice band first, the bodice band and the straps first, and then we're going to work on the following one, we're going to work on the side panels and putting those together. Because then the fourth one is that not the fourth one, the next one after that, because I'm out of sequence, the next one after that is we're going to attach those tiers to the front and back panel and then attach it to the centre bodice, to this band bodice. So we have a few steps to go, but each time you do it, you'll get quicker. And each time, I have to take time out to explain everything and why we're doing something, because I want to pass on as many tips as I can do. So that makes it longer. The other reason that my videos are longer is because I don't edit out all of the work, because I think that's unfair on you to present you with a 15-minute video and say you can sew a dress in this amount of time, because you can't. Not well, and not to a good level, and not get a good fit as well, unless you're on your 4th or your 5th iteration of it, and then you can just bang them out, you know, as quickly as anything, because you know what you're doing and you're familiar with it. So I just want you to know that when you first start sewing and dressmaking, it takes a lot of time to pick all of this up, and it'll feel like you're pulling teeth sometimes, it'll feel painful process, but the next time you come to cutting out, the next time you come to making a toile, the next time you come to making pattern alterations, you'll get quicker and quicker and quicker, because it starts to sink in and you'll start to understand why you're doing what you're doing. And once that all starts to build, you then build that knowledge, and then you'll be able to apply those same techniques to any of the other patterns that you may want to do in the future, and you won't need me sitting on your shoulder then helping you and telling you what to do. You'll be thinking, yeah, what would Claire do? How would she do this? I know what she'll do. She'll measure her grain lines, she'll make sure she gets the best out of her fabric, and you'll find that you'll start doing those things automatically too, and then you get a gold star. So I hope you've enjoyed sewing along with me. Well, I can't say sewing, cutting out with me today. It has been a long one, but hopefully you've learned some new tips and tricks with what we've done. If you're not a subscriber and you're enjoying this series, please do consider subscribing. I think about 40% of the people who watch my videos are subscribers, and the rest, 60%, aren't. So I'd be really grateful if you would consider just hitting the subscribe button, and then, yeah, like to have you along. Oh, the other thing is I have got a Facebook group as well, for a sewing support Facebook group. So if you are sewing along with me and you want to join the Facebook group, then I'll put the title up here, it's Sewing by Claire, which is all one word, it's got a space, then a hyphen, then a space, and then sewing support group. And there are 4 membership questions that you need to answer, because that's my way of just making sure that people who are joining are genuine. So if you can answer those questions for me, please, because I'll decline you if you don't, and just say, and I'll say you've not answered the questions. But if you can do that, then you'll be admitted into the group, and then if you've got any questions, you can let me know. If you want to post any pictures of what you're making or where you're stuck at, again, I can help you. And if you just want to see what else I'm up to and the rest of the group, it's a really nice bunch of people in there, so I hope that you might consider joining. Okay, I'm off for a glass of water. I think I've earned it. I hope I hope everything's good. I hope everything's all working for you. Hoping you're having a good day. Don't try and do this if you're stressed. Just choose a time when you're nice and calm. You've got a little bit of time to yourself, and you can get stuck in, and everything will be fine. I promise. Okay. Take care, everybody. Nice to see you. Happy stitching. Bye.